Ich möchte in höflicher Weise und in der internationalistischen Weise auch einige Einführungsbeobachtungen machen. Es gibt sehr wenig Zeit, also es wird nur sehr kurz sein. Was ist nicht in meinem Vortrag vorhanden? Ich soll nur in einem Satz erwähnen, das Heldentum, die heroische Größe und die Schauerlichkeit der kommunistischen Weltbewegung. Das ist eine tragische Geschichte, das ernst genommen werden soll. Und das habe ich natürlich vernachlässigt in meinem Vortrag. Aber wir sollen nicht nur an Lebendigen, aber auch an Toten denken. Und jetzt auf Englisch. Our beloved heroine has said, our choice is socialism or barbarism. It is quite clear what she meant. Capitalism threatens to annihilate civilization. Socialism took it upon itself to save it. By socialism, we should understand the real movement. Trade unions, workers' parties, workers' councils, proletarian revolutions, a large body of theory and of committed art, and the resulting systems of government that set its face against capital and the bourgeois state, and thus attempted to save and transform civilization as it has found it. Civilization has certainly survived, such as it is, thanks to socialism. Nuclear war has been averted, and for a while we might have witnessed a slight attenuation of cruelty and a minuscule retreat of misery and inequality, at least there where the workers' movement could force temporary compromises on the adversary. While fighting barbarism and saving civilization, socialism had become barbarous itself and was compelled to forget how to be socialist. Socialism aimed at equality in all senses, social fairness, a well-anchored presence of the working class in politics, where the party has played the role of the tribunus plebis. In some places it has expropriated private companies and let them be run by the state, helped introduce universal franchise, old age pensions, paid holidays, free schools and free health care, higher wages, shorter working hours, cheap housing, cheap mass transport, unemployment benefit, social assistance of various kinds, upheld the possibility of a strong cultural opposition to the system, thereby making bourgeois society freer, more pluralistic, less racist and sexist, mostly rid of traditional deference and humility, less religious, less punitive, more hedonistic in its general outlook, less restrictive in its sexual mores, and so on. This is indeed an advance of civilization, of course at a tremendous cost. Be that as it may, the perfected variant of bourgeois society, modern liberal democracy, would have never come into being without the contribution of socialism, given the intrinsic and pervasive political weakness of the bourgeoisie, which was always sharing its class power with either elements of the Ancien Régime or failing that with representatives of the working class or various state elites, such as in recent past, the military and other bureaucratic apparatuses marching to the beat of a different drummer. It is precisely this civilization which is collapsing all around us now. This would forcibly remind us, and it should, that we communists are barbarians, that we are enemies of civilization, that the salvaging work of socialism has only propped up capitalism, which is the only kind of civilization to be had, if the separations that are at its base persist. And this civilization is sure to destroy itself and humanity, exactly as Rosa Luxemburg had predicted. 4. It is communism that wishes to put an end to a whole comprehensive system of separations. to the separation of the producers and of means of production, to the separation of the propertied and the propertyless, to the difference between citizens and non-citizens, to the difference between men and women, between adults and children, between straight and queer, between people well and ill, between manual and intellectual labor, between leaders and led, between exploiters and exploited, between oppressors and oppressed, between rich and poor, between proletarian and bourgeois, between colored and white, between state and civil society, between science and religion, between theory and practice, between sane and insane, between authority and subversion, between work and leisure, between producer and consumer, between knowledge and ignorance, between teachers and taught, between soul and body, between art and life, between town and country, between courtesy and kindness, between desire and love, between community and individuality, between action and reflection, between nature and artifice, between beautiful and ugly, between law and morals, between tradition and innovation, between memory and oblivion, between identity and difference, between state and civil society, between priest and layman, between powerful and powerless, between fortunate and unfortunate, between strong and weak, between armed and unarmed, between raptor and victim, between expert and amateur, between art and audience, between successful and unsuccessful, between closed text and talk, writing and speaking, between friend and foe, between public and private, between guest and host, between home and abroad, between strange and familiar, between inner and outer. Our civilization has been humanized thanks to separation. It has separated powers, branches of government, because there is power. It has declared pluralism and tolerance because it has given up on truth. It draws frontiers and boundaries because it cannot trust merely human, that is, political communities. It must ground them on race, ethnicity, language, culture, tradition, inertia of the past, on any social passion that transcends or seems to transcend class. It redistributes wealth because wealth is always ill distributed. It offers legal redress for injustice, for it is unjust. It enforces voluntary contracts between the unequal to offer formal equality, as there is no substantial equality. It offers marriage to make peace between men and women whom it has made into enemies. It punishes thieves because there is property. It enforces taxation, as people don't feel they have to contribute to the common good that does not appear to exist. It instigates elections, as the permanent power of the same powerful men would be intolerable, thereby recognizing what everybody knows, that power is evil. It differentiates between legal entitlements and rights and informal power. It tries to mitigate cultural differences through schooling, as raw, untutored humanity sinks into spectacular idiocy as economic, political, military, and cultural powers seem to coagulate. Socialism has contributed to closing the unfinished business of the Enlightenment, to the closing of the unfinished business of creating representative government, to the completion of the incomplete industrialization, urbanization, and secularization. But most importantly, it has helped replace subordination with separation, to replace status by contract. And therefore it was the co-author of bourgeois modernity. At the origin of exploitation, there is the separation of the producers from the means of production. The latter are owned by the capitalist. The former have only themselves, their time, to offer. Through buying means of production and buying time, the capitalist fuses persons and stuff, fuses labor and capital, fuses matter and time, mediating it through money. The proletarian has to go voluntarily, deliberately to the capitalist to offer her time to the latter. The contract formalizing the sale is a voluntary act between equals. At the moment of this transaction, but not later, The proletarian is not the subordinate of the bourgeois, and she is not her superior. In agrarian and aristocratic societies, producers do sometimes own their means of production, land or cattle, and the surplus is appropriated through legal means, taxes, tithes, corvées, etc., by the lord. For the lord is the superior of the subordinate and subaltern peasant or laborer, whose giving up on surplus value is coerced through the legal acceptance and enforcement of hierarchy. Hierarchy does not disappear from capitalism altogether, but it is frequently merely supernumerary. The separation and thus the fusion are perfected only in capitalism. Socialism, the real movement, has improved contracts. The price of labor force has gone up, working hours down, reducing misery and legitimizing separation. Entering production through the gate of the labor contract, solemnizing the sale of her time, the proletarian loses immediately her status of a contracting party equal to and as free as the capitalist. She will become a subordinate, but less to a person or persons than to capital as such, this subordination mediated through the general intellect, technology and science. Blueprints, algorithms, softwares, instructions, regulations are not negotiated, but prescribed or ordered to increase efficiency, that is productivity. The social division of labor separates proletarians into professions with the concomitant ideology of proficiency, of pride of workmanship. Life in the workplace is devoid of the civil liberties allegedly obtaining outside in the marketplace and the public sphere. Rhythm, movement, bodily needs, space of confinement, the effort required, behavior, even style are determined by rigid rules. The profound wisdom of the ancients who equated freedom with leisure is vindicated. As Marx has repeatedly shown, life begins after work. How is this possible in a society which deems itself free? It is realized in a quite unencumbered manner by the specific idea that bourgeois modernity has of the correct separation of the public and of the private. Contractual relationships, being voluntary, non-hierarchical, symmetrical, are private. If you choose to sell yourself and your time under certain conditions, it is your affair. You can terminate such voluntarily assumed obligations at will. There are, of course, laws forbidding that you sell yourself into slavery, slaves being, after all, unpaid. There is hierarchy in the public sphere, however, but this hierarchy is legal, not personal, hence impermanent, unlike the old dispensation of rank and of the noble and the ignoble. The rule of law, within which personal freedom is protected by public authority within carefully defined limits. You may elect your member of parliament or mayor, and you can unseat him or her. You do not choose your exploiter, although you can sometimes choose your specific employer, or your boss, or your foreman, or contremaître at will. If public power wants to confine your movements, it has to argue before a court of law. If you are prevented at your workplace from talking or from urinating, no argument is necessary. By denying the presence of coercion and power in the workplace, which is the indispensable foundation of inner peace and cohesion in capitalist society, bourgeois modernity produces the semblance of liberty to great effect. In aristocratic societies, of which feudalism is only one, coercion is unified in so is supremacy. Coercion stems from hierarchy, thus it is an accepted feature of the human condition, and liberty is an enclave. Given that labor is not a universal condition, there are escapes, such as monasteries and pilgrimages, respect for mendicants and the destitute, a possible escape from the generality of procreative sex and marriage, and time is not unified in the capitalist manner. In capitalism, time is cut in two, labor time and leisure time. Both are decreed to be private. Labor time is private since it is under the rule of private contracts, assumed under the dominion and through the mediation of the market, which is, beside Öffentlichkeit and voluntary association, the main component of civil society as opposed to the state, which is virtually synonymous with the public. But so is leisure time, where the producer who has ended her work is celebrating her Feierabend as a consumer, a person at rest or a person at play, a householder, a parent, a sexual partner, or as a person out of her mind, asleep. When and where does a proletarian enter the public sphere? The public sphere, politics, law, legislation, jurisprudence, natural right and constitution, morals, appears to the proletarian as an abstraction outside her time, which is filled absolutely with the private, apparently wholly determined by choice. As both work and leisure are presented as governed by choice, obligations are inherent and hidden, seemingly mere consequences of a natural order, only framed from the outside by legal conditions and guarantees. Obligations appear only in the breach for the taxpayer, debtor, voter, nation-state citizen, enlisted soldier, which proletarians are exclusively when they are neither working nor at leisure while they are private persons. Proletarians and the bourgeois alike can participate in politics in their free time as private citizens, a beautiful English oxymoron, private citizen, in electoral constituencies, districts where they are placed according to where they live as private householders. Nevertheless, their separation from the public is absolute. Hence, political subjectivity is nowhere to be found. Representation is, of course, no prima facie domination, but it is, quite in Carl Schmitt's sense, a neutralization, a dissolution of politics, law, and morals by way of entrusting political subjectivity, collective deliberation, and rationality literally to others, limited in transforming this into autocratic rule by another abstraction, a superior law legislating law, constitutions, international law, judicially created law, natural right and human rights, and so on. Separation ends in conflation, resulting thereby in separations within the person, bourgeois and citoyen, man and citizen, the reign of desire and the reign of reason, this latter always construed as self-limiting, altruistic, diligent, thrifty, disciplined, and so on, reunited against, in a putative community, the nation and similar constructs. Socialism, the real movement, represented in the West by social democracy and its ramifications such as Euro-communism, and in the East by really existing socialism, has done nothing to obliterate this state of affairs. It has effected progress in patches, and it has instituted a sort of counter-power in the guise of a new tribunate. It was able to defend an adversary culture, ranging from high modernism to revolutionary countercultures and subcultures which it hated all along, and it created a collective ideological dignity for a people of have-nots. By remaining within the orbit of capitalism, it has replaced the class struggle with a largely fictitious conflict between the market and the state, or a rational government of planners, which is still what the world press calls socialism. Planning is another name for egalitarian top-down redistribution, as though the market were not a device of redistribution. Both are, as well, and as though there could exist a market without legal regulation, that is, planning. As far as the proletarians as consumers and political actors are concerned, planning through prescription of natural quantitative production goals and of consumer prices in real socialism, or planning through taxation, monetary and budgetary controls in market capitalism, differs only as to its social content. Austerity measures aiming at the reduction of real wages, at the increase of relative labor time and the creation of industrial reserve armies, being perfectly possible in both. For the fundamental separation, that of the producers and of the means of production persists in both, in spite of the initial taking of political power by the proletarian party. And of course, the separation of politics and of the economy is a key feature of capitalism to begin with. The name of state capitalism, you talked about it, is acceptable if we take into account several factors. Real socialism was state capitalism only from the point of view of the proletariat, surely a privileged sight for us. As I said before, it does not matter one iota for the proletarian producer whether the means of production are owned by a person, by a limited liability company, an investment fund, or the socialist state led by the Workers' Party, and as she has to sell her labor force and labor time in order to have access to the means of production to enable her to earn a living, and whereby she spends her life forces on objectives independent and alien to her. Even the real subsumption of labor to capital is not prevented by public ownership. But from the point of view of the bourgeois revolution, still an unfinished business and likely to remain so, completed within the historical limits of the possible by various social regimes, the picture is different. Fascists were not entirely mistaken in treating liberalism and socialism as their twin enemies. The common term for both was in the Nazi vocabulary, curiously, Marxism, which according to the Horst Wessel lead had to be trampled together with the reaction, i.e. the conservative and monarchist soldatesca and high bureaucracy. This is of course an error as far as communist theory is concerned, for communism is beyond enlightenment, although real socialism, both the social democratic and the Bolshevik version, is its pinnacle. We have to examine this aspect very carefully as to the future of communism, at least in Europe, China and a few other regions with a real socialist past, depends on it. I do not speak of mere industrialization, urbanization, secularization of any such, but of the success of real socialism. Planned state capitalism is bringing forth a people. That's the essential point of view I want to put to you. This success is obscured by the vexed problem of democracy versus dictatorship. Here I am attempting only to describe something that is more or less common in social democracy and in Soviet-type societies. The political question is naturally whether the creation of a people is relevant in regarding the devastated field of ruins baptized real socialism as a possible ground for the communist project or not. The creation of a people by planned state socialism, state capitalism, steered by an initially proletarian party, should be regarded primarily from the simple Aristotelian definition of democracy as the rule of the poor over the rich, defined similarly by Pseudo-Xenophon, the unknown author of the arch-conservative tract, The Constitution of the Athenians in the 4th century BC, as the rule of the wretched over quality. This did not ever mean that poverty was or was likely to be ended, only that social power could be counterbalanced by political power and thus balanced. The Roman tribunate did not aim at the obliteration of property, only at the rehabilitation of ager publicus and handouts to the indigent and the preservation of an independent counterpower. Democracy has also meant lay power, magistrates and political leaders elected by drawing lots, and devices to prevent strong political or military privilege. The people, essentially the propertyless and free, was circumscribed by social position as opposed to the nation, with an arrangement that sanctified conflict under the political preponderance of the lower classes, hoi polloi, the many. However little this has to do with the original socialist idea, it was ideologically inherited from the radical strands of the French Revolution, from Babeuf to Blanqui, and it has become the essence of real socialism, whose work was, and this explains in part its horrors of tyranny and persecution, to annihilate old elites and to instaurate the classical republican idea of political equality in the sense of the power of the men of the people, meaning in practice committed, class-conscious and organized workers and organic party intellectuals. This is power as absolute as power could ever get, but this should not hide from us its defining negative function. Real socialism remained beyond doubt a class society, but paradoxically without a full-bore authentic ruling class. The traditional kind of ruling class, with its concomitant authority, deference, roles handed down, permanence of position, cultural independence, habitus, style, elegance, manners, taste, bodily demeanor, patronage, conspicuous consumption, pomp and circumstance, orgueil, all based on wealth inherited and hereditary, disappeared altogether. Roles, functions, positions, influence, and impermanent rank were constantly redistributed in real socialism. The actual ruling was done by an institution, the members of which were subject to the rotation, advancement, and rustications or limogement usual in an institution. To use an imperfect historical parallel, a court rather than a nobility. Property, the ownership of the means of production, was separated from the producers, but was not individualized. And control as such cannot be and was not inherited. Those who exercised control were selected politically and bureaucratically, not according to the hereditary privileges of their forebears, assured by the concept of property inherent in Roman law, decisive in all white and many other caste or class societies. Imprecisely and perhaps even erroneously, it was the state that was seen to personify, in fact it has depersonalized, class rule in real socialism, hence the intensely moralized and politicized character of proletarian revolutions against real socialism. From Kronstadt to Berlin 53, Budapest 56, Prague 68, Gdansk 81, Timisoara 89. Where socialism of any kind is involved, politics cannot be far behind. In real socialism, many things were hidden, such as inequality, exploitation, oppression, poverty, and resistance to all this. One thing, though, the sheer fact of power, never. The party has always posed the question of power, since it was power, and it has decreed that the people had power as long as the state owned most economic assets, and the party was the only authority allowed to rule the state in the interest of the many, and as relaxation of this double exercise of power would threaten equality and supremacy. Anybody arguing against the party had to prove that any gain in any other respect would not put popular, more precisely plebeian rule, the tribunate, and this virtual synonym, equality, at risk. This task was fulfilled by the revolutions mentioned that were mostly egalitarian, as you have shown, plebeian, ideologically socialist, not communist revolutions. The character of these plebeian societies were the cult of work and of the worker, where the usual tableau of virtues was reversed to an extent unknown in the West, where heroism and altruism were attributed to the everyday, and where, however fraudulently, resistance and disobedience were extolled as virtues, where not kings, but recalcitrant retainers were praised, where historical revolutions were never presented as mob rule, where misfortune was not attributed, like in our societies today, to personal failure, but to injustice, but where people who tried to act upon those virtuous ideas were punished, cannot be understood if we do not take into account the dominance of anti-clericalism and atheism, the glorifying of science and advanced technology, the respect in which especially modern high culture was held. This militant positivism and modernism, in conjunction with the central state idea of equality, which shaped a society without the hereditary and radically separated ruling class, so that if compared to the West, it was virtually headless, as the dynastic pretensions of some of the dictators provoked only hilarity, the source of fear was elsewhere, has increased the feeling of a human world thoroughly cleansed of the sacred. I'm not stressing here the well-known repressive, mendacious, and generally unfree character of Eastern real socialist regimes, as I have done copiously elsewhere. What I'm trying to do now is to examine whether the specific ground created by a planned state capitalism, dominated by an egalitarian, rationalistic, and secular politics expressed, disseminated, and enforced by the single party, ideologically committed to socialism and to the working class, is or is not fertile for the communist project, opposed to the separations essential for the survival of what we would broadly call capitalism. Here, as I'm not writing detailed political history, I shall largely omit the 20 or so troubled years passed since the Wende, which do not seem to have swept away some of these determinations, especially three factors. One, egalitarianism and the consubstantial lack of deference and the lack of a clear sense of legitimate authority. This has remained in Eastern Europe. Two, an unprecedented absence of the sacred. Three, a sharply political view of the economy and of the state not regarded in separation. These are not merely thought habits or an illiberal political culture. These are social characteristics, also they hang together. There can be no doubt that the very special version of a state capitalism dubbed real socialism has missed the rather limited goals of the classical workers' movement as formulated by Kautsky, Otto Bauer, Lenin and Trotsky, giants, but giants of a bygone era. However, its historical creation was not just another, at the time quite advanced variant of exploitation, decorated with an emancipatory message confined in the main to symbolism. Also, while it should be clearly distinguished from the ultimate communist project, we should not be too slow to recognize its sometimes rather repulsive and often tragic grandeur. Whatever we might feel about it, and paying our silent respect to its countless victims, it has made a clean sweep of authority that was unprecedented in scale and in subversive, destructive, negative durability. What I mean by an astonishing absence of the sacred is not simply a conspicuous absence of mysterium tremendum, which is anyway increasingly foreign to the modern experience since the 16th century. The sense that there is nothing intrinsically inviolable has been confined in the West to radical avant-gardes. While real socialism has not been exactly famous for bold experimentation, it could never entirely repudiate its revolutionary and rationalistic origins. It regarded itself as an order resting on philosophy and science. And censorship does not preclude a fundamental and sincere, however misguided, love for truth. Even people who are striving towards truth and have but a slight chance to attain it have to recognize at the start that mere belief will not do. The Holy Inquisition and the Santa Hermandad could not and did not uprule all authentic Christian faith, nor did Stalin's censorship and the uniformly imposed party line totally deracinate the philosophical, not theological character of the regime's political self-understanding. Philosophy here signifies something similar to what was called in the 18th century Newtonian philosophy, an allegedly illusionless conception of nature and man. By the way, this is no novelty. Herr Sonnenfels, the confidential minister of the great enlightened despot, Emperor Joseph II of Austria, was at the same time the head of his secret police and virtually the inventor of the genre, with covert reports on the opinions of His Majesty's subjects, and his propaganda chief, the organizer of his radical but loyal opposition, progressive Masonic lodges, who edited a philosophical political monthly called Der Mann ohne Vorurteil. While Stalinists tried at times to dilute their wine with nationalist and even anti-Semitic dishwater, this was a failure. Apart from this, legitimacy, a term I happen to detest, was not offered out of origins, descendants, tradition, something earlier and higher, especially not anything divine. What can be more secular than to refer the elevated conceptual moment of foundation to interests denied so vehemently by all other class societies, so subservient to those? Which other class society would dare to mention class, in this case the working class, in foundational constitutional documents? Which state, with the partial and paradoxical exception of the United States, would venture to obliterate all ethnic and or geographic regional reference from its name, the Soviet Union, to make an international flag, the red flag, its own, and the Internationale, its first national anthem, and the terrestrial globe, hugged by stripes saying in all languages, proletarians of all countries unite, its coat of arms? The defunct German Democratic Republic had a crossed hammer and caliper compass in its coat of arms, very Masonic, if you ask me. No lions, no unicorns. One of the reasons why real socialism had to be so tyrannical and bloodthirsty, similar to certain phases of the French Revolution, was that it was not blessed with any kind of cohesive ideology making an even implicit claim to the suprahuman, to any prior certainty implied in the most mundane and trivial constitutional